The day I discovered my parents had been sneaking into my apartment wasn't the day my world shattered. It was the day I realized just how far they would go. I'd walk in to find lights on that I hadn't touched. Meals I never made. Blankets molded by someone else's presence. Every shadow hinted I was never truly alone. People assume family crosses boundaries out of care. But what if crossing those lines is the only way they know how to control you? The real turning point came the moment I vanished. I wasn't always this guarded. Once, I thought boundaries were clear, you set them, people honor them. But in my family, a line was only a suggestion. Perhaps that's why, even at 29, my chest tightened every time my phone blinked with my mother's name, or my father's voice dripped with that soft, manipulative guilt he wielded to quietly claim what he wanted. I grew up under two sets of rules. One for Liana. One that strangled me. My room was glass. Her room was a fortress. My diaries were open books, her mistakes were new chapters that everyone forgave. Have you ever been treated like a lesson rather than a person? My mother would walk in unannounced, hands searching for explanations inside the pages of my life. She called it care. She called it protection. My father watched, the same steady shrug that kept him safe from conflict. He would say, later, I didn't want to make waves. So I learned to hide small things, thoughts, late-night notes, plans I didn't want cut short. I learned that privacy was a luxury other people could afford. When I finally rented that one bedroom, the relief was ridiculous. I set the apartment up with careful joy. The color of the curtains was deliberate. The angle of the couch was a kind of prayer. But the relief was only as strong as the locks on my door. And locks, I learned, are only as good as the people who respect them. A visit. A story. A lie to a landlord. A key handed to Liana like a pardon. Each act a rope they used to pull me back. I noticed little traces, tabs on my laptop open to searches I hadn't made, my sweater missing, mascara smudged on my mirror. Evidence accumulated as quietly as dust. I tried to tell them. I called my mother. She sounded hurt by the idea I would keep her out. We're family, she said. We need to be close. Close was what suffocated me. Close was what erased the line between care and claim. I booked therapy and listened as someone said the words that felt like a map. You need distance, she said. They can't override your life. Could a therapist's recommendation become a plan? For me, that day, it did. I searched for a building with rules written into its bones, keycard access, staffed lobby, cameras in every hallway. A place where polite charm could not be used as a master key. On the tour I stood in the corner unit imagining silence. I signed the lease with fingers that were steady for the first time. That night I called Mara and Jonah. They were the kind of friends who understood urgency without drama. They arrived with boxes and quiet words. We packed like people who had practiced leaving for years. Every mug that bore my mother's taste was boxed. Photos were left behind. I took the parts of me that mattered. At 2 a.m. we moved. The truck hummed away. I slid the emergency key into an envelope and left no forwarding address. For 3 days I stayed with the phone face down. I let my lungs relearn quiet. The building felt safe because it had anonymity ingrained within it. But safety, as I learned, can still create ripples. My family's panic became a ripple that found the police. Someone called thinking of a climb and a knock and the wrong kind of noise. At the station, they were there, my mother, my father, Liana, each playing a role they had always been allowed to play. Each surprised at the new script. Officer Ramirez was steady. She asked the right questions, the kind that cut gently but cleanly. Are you safe? Did they force entry? Where have you been? My mother's story unfolded as urgency. We thought she was in danger. My father's voice tried to balance apology and defense. Liana's face carried both guilt and the habits of entitlement. Yet when the officer suggested a written boundary, a formal documentation, they looked at it as if it were a verdict. They signed. It was small and huge all at once. I felt something unspool inside me. The signature was a line drawn in ink where words had failed. It gave me more than protection. It gave me a name for what I needed. Have you ever watched someone accept a rule and, slowly, feel the world tilt? That tilt began my healing. After the signatures, the house was quieter. Not because the family had changed overnight, but because the rules finally had a weight. For the first time, my mother arrived like a visitor, not a force. She sat across from me in public, fingers folded, unsure of which boundaries applied. I remember the way she watched my hands when we met at a small cafe. As if she was learning a new alphabet of permission. Have you noticed how people can misread silence as punishment? She called it betrayal. I called it survival. My father's posture softened. He listened more and spoke in smaller sentences. Lionna's embarrassment was slow. Public shame is a patient teacher. But distance isn't healing by itself. It gave space for conversations, awkward and careful. It gave me a chance to be seen as an adult. We met near Union Station at a small table where the rules were obvious. No one could just walk into my life from the shadows. At first, their gestures were tentative. My mother reached for a hand and then drew back. She practiced restraint like someone learning a new dance. When she asked why I hadn't told them, I said simply, because telling didn't stop it. The words were quiet but hard. They landed. Lionna, who had always treated my things like a communal chest, began to see the cost of entitlement. She had to learn a humility that shame alone could not teach. I did not want to punish them. I wanted them to understand. And in those small meetings, things changed in the shape of soft admissions. My mother admitted she had read my journals. Not in anger, she said, but in fear. Fear dressed as curiosity. Fear dressed as care. I told her what it felt like to be unreadable in a house where everything was expected to be transparent. She listened, and sometimes that listening looked like apology. But there were fractures. Old habits are stubborn. Sometimes my mother would slip, an unanswered text, a question too many. I called it out. We talked. We recalibrated. My father apologized for not stepping in sooner. His apology sounded like relief more than regret. He said he feared making me angrier. Have you ever received an apology that felt like a key turning? It can open something that had been stuck for years. As weeks passed, the ice melted in small increments. Lionna came when invited. She brought coffee instead of excuses. She learned that space had a cost and a grace. Yet each meeting held a tension. Old patterns pressed at the edges, testing the new rules. Could they be trusted? Could they be kept? I learned to measure trust in small things. Did they knock? Did they wait? Did they respect the line? Those were the proofs that mattered. Slowly, my life expanded. I spent mornings without bracing. I cooked and left the windows open. The apartment kept its own quiet. But healing is not a straight line. A moment of progress can be followed by a familiar trespass disguised as worry. I stayed vigilant. One evening Lionna showed up with a story, a job interview she wanted me to help with. She asked for advice in a way she never had before. She listened. I helped. That night I felt a small, honest shift inside me. Not complete. Not perfect. But real. The things that had been dragged across my life began to smooth out. Still, I kept my boundaries in writing. The agreement at the station was a small document, but it became a ritual, reminders to both of us about the rules that keep people safe. Have you ever made a boundary feel like a map? It tells people where they may walk and where they must stop. It kept me whole. Months passed in a measured rhythm. The worst of it no longer defined every day. I learned to tether hope to small, verifiable acts, calls returned, knocks made, respect shown in the little ways that make a life livable. But life has edges where past and present collide. One afternoon, an email arrived. A forwarded message of my old landlord, asking if I'd been okay. He'd been contacted again. My heart tightened. Old ties were not fully severed. Old people still held old keys. This was the storm I had feared, their panic spilling into public space, their assumptions creating noise where there should have been quiet. I met Officer Ramirez again, this time not as a witness but as someone who wanted to understand how the law could hold lines for a person who had to keep herself safe. She recommended formal documentation beyond the informal agreement, a written record that could be referred to should lines be crossed again. Not a courtroom, but a clear paper map. We sat across from each other and made a plan. I felt steadier because the world had a form that matched my need. The law became another wall, a practical one. The twist was not in a dramatic confrontation. It was quieter. My family began to show up at the edges of my life, differently. Not to enter, but to wait. Lyanna started leaving messages instead of dropping by. My mother called less and listened more. My father sent a book with a note inside, no heavy words, just a hope that we could build something new. These small gestures were not fireworks. They were bricks. Brick by brick they built a distance that could hold us. One night I invited them to a small dinner in a neutral space. I wanted to test the repairs. I wanted to see if trust could be rebuilt on terms other than unconscious possession. We sat under warm lights. The conversation was careful. Missteps happened. Apologies were made. Tears came without spectacle. It was an ordinary miracle, tedious, fragile, but real. A plot twist, if you can call it that, arrived when Lyanna admitted she had used my things because she didn't know where she ended and I began. It was a confession soaked in shame and also relief. She said, "I never realized I was stepping into your life because I thought it was ours." That sentence cracked something open I hadn't expected to need. Betrayal had been a shape we all wore. Now, admitted, it could be refitted. My mother said she had read my journals out of fear. Fear is not permission. She learned how to live with that. We did not conjure a perfect family that night. We conjured a new one, imperfect, negotiated, slow. That is the only kind that lasts. Healing hugged the ordinary. I bought a plant for my kitchen. I forgot to water it. I learned that small responsibility was a way to practice being tender with myself. Sometimes the smallest acts of self-care were the biggest rebellions, a locked door, a text sent in the day, a photo posted only after I chose it. The city still hummed outside my windows. But inside, the air felt less crowded. I could write without pausing, cook without arranging for someone else's taste, fall asleep without bracing. And yet I kept the paperwork. Not as a weapon, but as proof. A map for anyone tempted to lose their way back into my life. A line that said, plainly, this far, no farther. Have you noticed how protection can start small and still contain a life? That was my protection, quiet, legal, humane. The months that followed were not dramatic. They were patient. They were precise. They were work. Each visit required practice. Each apology had to be earned or refused. Each request had to be judged against the map I had drawn. My mother learned to ask before entering. It was clumsy at first, text that asked permission, but it was permission nonetheless. My father practiced boundaries by holding space and listening. Lyanna's humility did not arrive as a thunderbolt. It arrived as consistent small acts, returning things, asking, waiting. She grew into the edges of her life without borrowing mine. There were days I faltered. Old fear rose like a tide. But then I would remember the paper at the station, my signature, a line I had chosen to keep. Do you know how it feels to make a decision that redefines the language of your life? To go from being taken to taking care of yourself? It is steadying. It is frightening. It is free. One afternoon, I walked through my apartment with a friend who had watched me leave in the dark and arrive in the light. She touched the bookshelf and said, quietly, "You belong here." That belongness was not a thing handed to me. It was a skill I learned. It was not given by my parents. It was earned by my choosing myself. I tell this not as accusation, but as ledger. People love in ways that sometimes break us. They fix that with apologies, sometimes with change, sometimes not. We get to choose what we accept. What I did was choose a life with lock and law, with quiet and presence. I chose to be visible not by being owned, but by being known on my terms. My family remains in my life, now framed by lines that keep everyone safe. We meet in cafes and parks and neutral corners. We laugh in ways that do not cut. We speak in ways that no longer claim. There is still tenderness. There is still grief. There are days when the old reflexes flare up and someone forgets the rules. We correct, apologize, and try again. That is the rhythm we made. The real redemption was not punishment for them. It was permission for me. Permission to breathe. Permission to keep an evening just for my own silence. Permission to sleep without bracing. If you are holding a door shut with all your heart, if you have ever had to step away to be seen, know that choosing yourself does not make you cruel. It makes you human. The locked door keeps my memories safe. The paper at the station keeps me safe from intrusion. The people in my life keep learning new ways of loving. And that is the quiet miracle. Not every family learns. Not every parent changes. But some do, if the edges are drawn and kept. If you have ever fought for your own space, you are not alone. There is a way to be gentle and firm at once. There is a way to keep the people you love without letting them take you. If this story touched you, if you've had to choose your own home and your own life, share your experience below. I'd like to hear it. If you want more stories that walk slowly through family pain and quiet victories, please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for listening.